Welcome to Podforest, where forest pros discuss forest woes. Our goal is to communicate with private landowners on a variety of forest health issues to support management and stewardship of your lands. In this podcast, we'll be discussing important topics in forest health with experts in multiple fields. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy this episode of the Proforest Podforest. Welcome back, everybody. Today we're joined by Dr. Bill Hammond, an assistant professor from the agronomy department here at the University of Florida. Bill is a plant ecophysiologist, and we're going to be talking about tree death. Now, that might sound like a pretty morbid topic, but it's actually a very interesting and very complex topic. So, Bill, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler, for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, so when we talk about tree death, I think most people probably have a preconceived idea of what a dying tree or what a dead tree looks like. And, if we think about humans, what death looks like for us. But with trees, it seems like it's a bit more complex than that. So is there any sort of agreed upon point in which we say a tree is actually dead?
Yeah. I think this is a really good question and a great way to start the episode here. I think to back it up a little bit before your question, if I may, that we have a hard time defining death in trees, I agree, but it's been difficult to pin down when exactly even a human is dead. And we're arguably the most studied organism on the planet, right, from a physiology and a biology standpoint. I guess to know what is dead, we first have to have some sort of an agreed upon definition of what it means to be alive. And this even is tricky. If you ask folks what life looks like, they'll usually constrain that in the context of all the life that's yet known here on this planet. If you ask an exobiologist what their definition of life is, it's probably a much more simpler and constrained definition, something like a sustaining chemical system that's subject to evolution, because we can imagine that life might look really different than it does on Earth, and so like death even might look really different. How do we know when a tree is dead? I think everybody, if you pointed to a tree that was alive and a tree that was dead, and you said, which one of these is dead, they would 100% of the time get it right, especially if that tree was what I would call good and dead. But where it gets really, really murky is like, when does a tree stop living and start dying? And this is the question that has plagued me since I was a graduate student, trying to understand when does an organism stop living and start dying, because for trees that's been really uncertain for a long time. And even for humans, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, there are manuscripts talking about how to define when a human dies as when they drew their last breath, right? And then after a couple thousand years, we learned about opening up bodies and seeing what was on the inside, and said, "Oh man, there's this thing that beats, and it's your heart, and you can that's that stuff we can feel in us. And when that stops, okay, that's when you're dead." And then fast forward another couple thousand years to modern medicine, and now we're like, no, actually, it's probably even if you've stopped breathing and your heart's gone, there's still these neurons firing electricity, right? And when that stops, you're brain dead, and then you're dead. But then that can happen, and then yet you can be on some machine and sustained and alive. And so what is death, even in you and in me, is really, really murky. And where it gets even wilder for a tree is, our bodies are composed of organs and systems that are really highly interdependent. By contrast, although there are some organs in trees, like the vascular systems, that are completely connected from the, bottommost root to the uppermost leaf in really interesting and sometimes very complex networks, they're also, in a sense, able to be really independent of one another. Trees are very modular organisms. And so part of a tree can die. And so the question of how do we know when a tree is dead is that's a scale dependent question, right? Some modes of death at some scale actually are like really adaptive. We see this every fall when the abscission zone in the leaves of a deciduous tree undergoes a programmed death at the scale of cells. Right? This greatly reduces leaf area, allows the opportunity to relocate nutrients for the next season, and prolongs the life at the scale of the organism. If there's an attack by an insect like a bark beetle, or like a stem-boring beetle, I guess, this might lead to the death of a branch, but not the organism. If there's a drought, it might lead to the death of 90% of the canopy, but not of the meristems that can grow when rains return and recover and help the organism survive. And so it kind of depends at the scale you ask that question. And so if you say, well, how do we know when a tree is dead? Now we've wandered into another definitions problem, which is like, what is a tree, right? And so, Tyler, this is where I'm going to ask you to define a tree for me, and then I'll continue with my answer.
Oh, goodness. Oh my gosh, this is going to be the embarrassment of the century. Here I am with a PhD in forest resources and conservation, my definition of a tree. Oh boy. A tree, I would say, is going to be a plant, for one thing. We're getting started basic. It's going to have an established root system, some level of a trunk system, and some level of canopy cover. That's my very basic definition of a tree.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most people would agree with you. If you asked anyone to draw a tree from, a kid in pre-K up to a great-grandfather, you'd probably come up with those three parts at least, right? There's like roots, there's a trunk, there's
branches,
there's an upper part.
Yep.
Maybe they'd draw a gymnosperm. That's certainly what I would choose to draw. They're my favorite. Or maybe they'd draw one of those flowering trees. That's fine too, with the kind of swirly curly canopy that kids do.
Here's a good reminder: I'm a social scientist by training.
Yeah? There you go. Okay. This is going to get interesting then. And so those are definitely important parts of being a tree. Some folks might add to that definition that it should have secondary growth, that it should be able to grow out. Some folks consider that palms are trees. What do you think? Are palms a tree?
Are palms a tree?
Yeah.
I think it might depend on the palm species, maybe, in my head, but we might be splitting hairs at that point.
Yeah, the ones with the roots and the big tall trunk that's as tall as Newland Ziegler and then a canopy at the top.
Yeah.
That's a tree? Yeah. And so if a tree is just a growth form, a way that something looks with those components, I completely agree with you. But for the purposes of our conversation around tree death, I primarily have studied, in addition to your components of what is a tree, organisms that can undergo secondary growth. So they don't just grow up, they also grow out. Like me now in my early 40s, I'm growing outward, so too do the trees as they add those annual rings of xylem on the inside of their cambium and phloem and bark on the outside of that same meristem. And so, when we ask, well, how do we know then when a tree is dead? This is kind of when all of the parts of the organism at that scale are unable to sustain their metabolism, right? And so if biological processes, metabolic processes, for a tree, this might be photosynthesis or respiration or any other number of secondary metabolic processes that basically stop happening. There's a couple of different ways that we can detect when that happens, but the scale at which it happens has to be at the scale of like the whole organism, the whole tree, right? Now, typically, we recognize you're trained as a forester, right? So how tall does a tree have to be a tree when they're counting them in the forest? You have like seedlings, saplings, and then trees.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, usually it's got to be like when they count trees in the forest inventories, and I'm not a forester.
Yeah,
I was trained as a botanist, but I've talked to a couple of foresters, and I think it has to be above breast height to be counted in the inventory, right?
Yeah, because we have diameter of breast height as a measurement.
Yep. And so before it's that tall, it's not on the record, and above that's all above the record. It can also be the case that the same root system can have multiple things above ground that end up being called a tree, right? But if we just consider that a tree is this this like single set of roots, a shoot, and a canopy, then at that scale, yeah, it's when all the metabolism is completely arrested, when the plant is no longer able to carry out, the basic processes, including growth, right? And so when experimentally we want to know, is this thing dead? And in my work, I've worked a lot with abiotic stressors, so environmental stressors like heat waves and intense drought, or sometimes both of these together. What it means is we have to kind of relieve the stressful conditions, return the plant to like an optimal set of conditions, just the right amount of moisture in the soil, the right amount of nutrients available, the right temperature, the right humidity in the air, the right amount of light. And if the plant can recover, it's not dead. And that may sound really, really simple, but this kind of approach to investigating like what kills trees is relatively new, because for a long, long time we've relied, even as scientists, on kind of visual cues and visual indications of when a tree is dying.
I think some people might have a sense of what those symptoms might look like, of what a dying tree looks like. But even then, like you said, even if it looks like it's quote-unquote dying, it could come back in some cases. So what would a dying tree perhaps look like?
There's so many different kinds of trees. There's probably over 60,000 different species or more of trees on Earth. And so I'll speak really, really generally.
Sure.
And I'm in my mind, Tyler, I'm imagining still this like cartoon of a tree that you drew for me. Okay. And so what I might expect is, the first thing is we should acknowledge that what we can't see is what's going on underground.
Sure.
And probably things are happening when a tree's dying underground that are really important. But I walk around often looking above ground, because it is like really bad for your back to be digging with a shovel all the time. And so I work mostly on the above ground parts. But above ground, the stuff that you might see at the top of the tree in the canopy is that it might start to thin. Where before maybe it was kind of full and lush, and whatever color that canopy is when it's healthy might somehow change. It might turn like yellow to gray to brown to all sorts of different colors. Or it might be that the apparent quality or color of the canopy is consistent, but it seems to somehow be thinning. The area of the canopy is reduced through time. And so this can be kind of an indication. For many trees, if the stressor is environmental, like if we're talking about a flood or heat stress or a drought, there can be a general transition from greenish to brownish colors, often with some like yellows there in the middle somewhere. But these indicators are coming to us from the canopy, from the leaves, which, depending on the species of tree, could be a really expendable and somewhat easily replaced organ. If the canopy of a tree that loses its leaves every year is looking thin and unhealthy, this could be something that bounces back next year, right? It was going to replace that canopy anyways. If it's an evergreen tree that keeps its canopy for 3 or 5 or 10 years and it starts to look that way, you might think, oh, this is a little bit more serious. It took a decade to build that canopy. And so that could be something that would be more concerning.
So what about on the inside of the tree? What might be happening when a tree is quote-unquote dying?
Yeah, it depends a lot on the stressor. I'll give an example of probably one of the most known mechanisms of tree mortality, which is that happens when, due to a number of reasons, the tree runs out of water, right? And this could happen if a tree was standing in too much water. It's in an anoxic root zone and it can't take up water, so it'll die of drought stress while it's flooded. It could happen during a drought. It could happen during a really intense hot period when water use is greatly amplified. It could happen because some sort of an organism is chewing into or biting into its vascular system. But in any event, what happens, we think, is this mechanism called hydraulic failure. And so trees are moving water from the soil solution, these like a water that's in the spaces between whatever the soil is the tree is growing in, and it's being transported through the vascular system of the tree up and out to the atmosphere. And what drives that is evaporation of water at the surface of the leaf. And because that water is stuck to itself, right, and can withstand a significant amount of tension, this is called cohesion tension theory, as the water evaporates at the surface of the leaf, kind of like a rope of water molecules behind that one that changes phase from liquid to vapor, is pulled up from the soil, through the roots, through the xylem, and back up to the leaf, right? And so as the evaporation's happening, as water's being pulled, and well, eventually, when water cannot be taken up at the root in adequate amount to supply this transpiration of water at the canopy, the ropes of water, the molecules of water traveling through this tissue I studied the most, the xylem, this system of pipes in the tree, it gets stretched out, kind of like a rubber band, right? It's the technical term is it's like a negative hydrostatic pressure. It's equivalent to a tension, though, and so we often call this xylem tension or water potential. And if that tension gets too high, the rope of water, the thread of water can snap. And when this breaks, what that is the conduits, the xylem where the water was traveling, instead of being filled with liquid water, now they're filled with water vapor. And have you ever had like a soda straw with a hole in it, so that instead of just pulling liquid through the tube, you were also pulling in a gas?
Mm-hmm.
And like, how efficient is that relative to one without air in the tube?
That's horrible.
It's terrible. Yeah, let's get rid of that thing. Well, we shouldn't be using straws anyways. But plants have to, right? And they build their own. And so once this air gets in, effectively that column of water, that rope of water is now blocked. And early on, there was a lot of debate about, are trees able to refill those conduits or not, right? Because you can imagine this air blockage, if enough of these little threads of water from the soil up to the canopy break, well, there's not going to be enough water now for the canopy, and the tree could die from a lack of water. And so early on, there was a lot of investigation into, well, that's a pretty bad system. Your pipe breaks and then it can't refill. And so a lot of early efforts focused on, for trees, what might be mechanisms by which this process is repaired and the tubes are refilled. At the time in plant hydraulics, the particular discipline of ecophysiology I specialize in, the way we were measuring the flow of water through this xylem system led to a lot of publications supporting the idea that these pipes could refill. But as we've kind of advanced in our efforts and our methods, and even using technologies like, people take trees to beam lines, particle accelerators, so they can do like high resolution X-ray scans of the tree to see what's happening as these pipes break during stresses like drought. Every time we look, we find, the case of a conduit refilling is exceptionally rare and maybe limited to some short-statured species, whereas it's much, much, much more common that once the rope of water is broken, it remains broken. And so the way to restore the movement of water is to grow a new pipe.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so the way out of this kind of legacy of dysfunction that a stressor or this hydraulic failure that can occur is to be able to grow new pipes. That secondary growth I was talking about is being kind of requisite. You can imagine now that like a palm tree, if it's going to be able to grow up, many tens of meters tall, and we know that some palms live for at least 150 years, because that's about how long we've had cameras, and we've seen pictures of the same damn palm trees still alive that long, which is wild, right? But they don't grow new pipes, and so their pipes must either have some way to refill, or likely they're just really, really safe. Palm trees are kind of built like a real tall cactus.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wonder if, when we talk about this process of dying and these sort of philosophical elements to it, and the outward appearance, the inward processes, could a tree that seemingly looks healthy be dying?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. When I was starting my PhD in like 2016, 2017, all of the literature I was reading on the death of gymnosperms, of conifers, in particular pine trees, because I got to put it on the record that pines are my favorite trees. And what was being used to determine when a tree started dying was when its canopy started turning brown.
Mm-hmm.
Just like we discussed earlier, that's pretty conventional way to go about it.
Sure.
And so I was doing experiments where I was imposing different intensities of drought stress and relieving them, and I was about to launch a big experiment, but before doing this, I launched a small pilot study, which is often these days what I encourage my own students to do. Like, oh, you're going to give a year of your life to this project, maybe you try something smaller first and make sure you like the plan you have. And I did this little pilot, and the literature said, the amount of water transport, the proportion of pipes that break that should kill a pine tree would be about 50%. In the literature, it's called P50, or where there's a 50% loss of the conductivity of water. And so I had these little pine trees. There were like 4 of them, I guess. And I withheld water to different intensities of drought stress that would cause, 25, 50, 75, and like almost 100% breakage of the water transport. And I gave them water, and they all lived. And what was really, really weird was the ones that went to the highest level, they lived, but like just barely, right? They like were resprouting. Their whole canopy almost died, but like the organism survived.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them, when I gave them water, when I relieved the stress, when I moved them away from stress back to the optimal conditions so I could monitor for survival, they all looked as green as when they started. Even though some of them would have massive canopy death, although the organism survived.
Sure.
And so I thought, well, that's interesting. If we're saying that when a tree starts to turn brown, when a pine tree's needles start to yellow or redden or eventually turn brown, this is the onset of dying. Maybe we're trying to investigate tree mortality and its mechanisms. At the time, we were really focused on a framework of is it hydraulic failure or what's called carbon starvation, running out of carbon that can kill a tree. We're now pretty sure it's almost always hydraulic failure, but carbon matters a bit too. Because the trees can be green when they're doomed, at least at the level of the organ or maybe the whole organism, does this mean that when we start investigating trees that are visually apparently changing color, we're showing up to the crime scene like way too late?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen that TV show, like The First 48 Hours? I've
heard about it though.
Those crime shows are always like, you gotta show up to the scene in the first 48 hours. And I started thinking about it that way in terms of like, wow, we really have to know when a tree stops living and starts dying, is committed to death, is terminal, and so to really figure out that moment, I thought it was actually going to be a pretty simple thing because the visual indicators were pretty clear. Hey, the canopy's turning brown. Eventually, I know a dead tree is going to look like that, and so that must be it. And so I had to use many, many more trees. There were like over 80, 2-meter tall sapling pine trees in the first tree mortality study I ever did as a result of that pilot. And one of the things I did was I very carefully quantified the color of the canopy at the maximum of stress. And so I had a little, there are these tissue color books, and it's kind of, if you've ever seen like a Pantone chart for colors, or you go to the store to pick out paint colors that, Lowe's or Home Depot or what have you. It was like that, a book, but it was made by this company Munsell, who makes these books for classifying soil colors for a long, long time, but they also have one for plant tissues. There's about like 2 pages in that book that cover the full gamut of all the colors from green to brown that a pine tree canopy could be. And I would take needles and hold them up and compare the color and quantify it. Here's the hue, value, and chroma of the canopy today. I'm an ecologist, so I wouldn't do it on every needle. I'd grab like a 3 and be like, this is the representative sample. But you try and grab the averagest colors of the canopy. And what was really interesting is like some of the trees that would go on to die, the ones that were at the highest level of stress, they might already be yellowing or even sort of reddish brown. But the trees that would go on to die, that were in kind of what I would call the space between, the level of stress where you could die, but it's not certain, they often would be green, and then they would go on to the whole canopy would die, and 90 days later they would be brown. And so there's a figure in that paper that kind of shows the visual indicators of mortality, especially in evergreen trees, can lag many months behind the onset of the actual like commitment to death of the tree. But yeah, this is a really good question. Those visual indicators can be misleading. They're probably a little more close to the moment of dying in a broadleaf tree with a really high leaf area, maybe. Evergreen trees are often really good at holding their water. They do everything kind of slow. They grow slower. They use water slower. They live often much longer. Depending on the tree, those visual indicators can be liars. And if you're wanting to know, okay, for example, when we were trying to figure out, is it, running out of carbon or running out of water that's killing the trees, imagine showing up 3 months after the tree started dying,
right,
and measuring the pools of water and carbon. You might be like, whoa, this might be what killed it. It would be like showing up to a graveyard and wanting to try and figure out what killed this thing. You might not a graveyard, showing up to like a crime scene 3 months late, and the body's laying there still, but now there's just like bugs all over it, and you're like, I think maybe bugs did it. It's like, oh, no. What if the bugs showed up because this thing was doomed, because it was already dying?
Yes.
And so, yeah, that wanders into another topic. There are interactions in the death of trees that require so much more knowledge than we have today. For example, if bark beetles are on a tree and it's dying, are those what killed it? Right? Like, my central question is often like, what kills trees?
Mm-hmm.
And really, unfortunately, I'm often asked at the end of talks and seminars, so what is it? And I'm like, well, that's the point. That's
why I'm here.
It depends. It's complicated. And so I was at a workshop in Guatemala with Yuri from the School of Forests. And it was a bark beetle workshop, and Yuri invited me because he was like, we think so much about these bugs, so we want you to come and tell us about the trees and what happens with trees in death. And part of the workshop was for us to go out to this pine forest where there was some tree death ongoing, and trees were dying. And I was like, how do you know trees are dying? They're like, oh, it's because they're turning brown. And they were pine trees. And so I was like, okay, all right, let's see what's going on. But actually, they, as part of the workshop, were going to fell a couple of these dying trees and basically pull the bark off and look for beetles. And so I said, can we also kind of work the tree? And it was interesting. They'd work the tree from the base all the way up to the apical meristem, the fella, 60-foot tall tree, and work it for its full length, looking for bark beetles and different forms of damage or even pathogens. And I was like, let's see what the tree can tell us about the stress it's been under. And so we took some thin sections with like my pocket knife and looked, and these trees that were apparently dying, and yes, they had exit wounds, D-shaped exit wound holes, and bark beetles on them. And you asking all of the foresters there at the workshop, what killed this tree? They're like, the bark beetle. See, you can see the hole. You can see the resin coming out. This is obvious what's going on. But when we looked at the rings of the tree, we could see that for about 4, maybe 5 years, its growth had slowed dramatically, right? So it had a really high sensitivity probably to climate stress. At the same time, its traumatic resin canals, this is like a response in the wood formation of these intercellular spaces that form and can fill with resin. Those didn't really start to ramp up in their density until maybe last year when like the beetles showed up.
Right.
And so the question is kind of like, well, was the tree on its way out? And so the beetles have just shown up, kind of like the bugs on the body 3 months after the murder. And this is why understanding when an organism stops living and starts dying is so important. We're getting better at it, especially in experimental conditions. One of the problems with trees, and studying this process in trees, is I can have 80 saplings that are as tall as you or me in a greenhouse and control the weather. I can manipulate the available nutrients, water, temperature. I can even simulate damage that might happen from insects or other things. But then you say, okay, what about in a mature tree? What about in an old growth tree? And now it's really, really hard to make those kinds of manipulations. And so we have to learn a lot of what we learn about the processes of life and death in Earth's longest living, tallest, and most massive organisms by working with their earlier life stages and with smaller plants. Or sometimes when we do go to the field, we have to excise, cut a branch off and do some manipulations in the lab to learn about it. But there remains a lot to be known about how these mechanisms do or don't hold up across the development and the life stage. If you look at the oldest living trees on the planet, while of course I think they're beautiful because they're pines, they also, as a tree, they just kind of look like hell. More than half of the canopy often is dead, and so one way to survive and to live a long time is maybe to be really good at dying. Not completely, but
Sure.
but in part, right? And so this like process of mortality is in trees, I think, is one that we'll continue to have to maybe come back and update this answer every decade or something. Yeah.
I watched Shawshank Redemption recently,
Yeah.
and I just keep thinking to get busy living or get busy dying based on what you just said.
Every time I rewater a tree in one of my experiments, I give it that old... Who said that? Was that Morgan Freeman's character said that?
He started it, and then
Andy Dufresne.
yeah, the character then reiterated it at some point.
Yeah, is it Tim Robbins? I can't remember.
I can't remember his name either.
That's a great flick, though. I love that. Yeah, so I've often said, get busy living or get busy dying, because when we relieve the stress, when we return the tree to optimal conditions, the big question mark is, a lot of experience has taught me, I could make a prediction about what's going to live and what's going to die, but oftentimes they'll surprise you. And in fact, one of the ways that they surprise you is that a tree might go on to apparently die, like its entire canopy will turn brown. But if you're paying close attention, its meristems, these tissues that can grow new pipes or grow new leaves or grow new roots, some of them live, and then the tree is able to grow back. And those ancient bristlecone pine trees that have snaggly dead branches on them, that's essentially what's happened. They've gone through some rare event. If you live a couple thousand years, the probability that a really extreme event is going to come along goes up and up and up with your age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's a really bad event once every 1,000 years and you live to be 5,000 years old, you're going to see some stuff.
Sure.
And so, yeah, this is probably something that is really worthy and deserving of a lot more of our study. The extent to which the modularity of mortality in trees is adaptive.
And finding that point of no return.
Yeah, the point
at
of
what
no
point
return.
is it terminal?
Mm-hmm.
And at what point is it actually dead? Because even a dying or dead, whenever we define that for a tree, can be teeming with life too.
Oh, yeah, of course. And so like they're not done with their ecosystem function or ecosystem service just because a tree has, even at the level of organism, died. You're totally right. A really beautiful example of that is seen when in the summer I teach a study abroad class in Costa Rica, plants and people in the Anthropocene. And I co-teach that with Rose Koenig. And in the plant ecology course that I teach as a part of that study abroad, we go out in all these different environments, from the montane rainforest to the cloud rainforest out to the dry forest. And especially in the lowland rainforests of Costa Rica, there are all these beautiful strangler figs. They make their way to the canopy as a vine or a liana. Eventually they grow all the way around their host, kill it, and its death has kind of given rise to an organism now that may last, longer than it did. To say nothing of the fact, I think what you're pointing at is that trees themselves, in their death or mortality, in whole or in part, provide really crucial habitat. Like right here in Florida, you think of like longleaf pine ecosystems and how important snags are for different species, like red cockaded woodpecker and other listed organisms.
So on a sort of global scale, which is a great way to start a question, right? Think as broad as you can. What are some of these leading causes of tree death? You'd mentioned drought and extreme weather events. Are these sorts of the trends that we're seeing globally?
There are so many ways to be killed as a tree, right? And I guess I want to, in my question, separate what's killing trees from why are trees dying. I think that probably one of the leading causes is still probably just humans through the direct act of, deforestation into areas that have not yet been clear cut. This is killing a lot of trees. These days, wildfires are causing a lot of tree death, especially when they're in areas that have already been under some warmer than usual weather or drought. I think I saw on the news this weekend that, in the Carolinas even, there's wildfires right now.
Mm-hmm.
A couple thousand acres burning. Insects kill trees, storms kill trees. It kind of depends, in the global picture on the type of forest that you're in, right? If you were to look at just tropical forest, for example, it seems like the number one thing that could kill a tree would be wind or lightning, right? It's storm damage in those systems. Whereas if you look at temperate systems lately, outside of some of these more direct, human removals and this kind of stuff, it's probably the combination of climate and fire, but most of that is really driven by the ongoing and further increasing warming of the planet. And so, like in 2022, which was, I can't believe it was 3 years ago now, we published a global analysis of tree mortality events from hotter drought. And we found that really what's often been called a drought-induced tree mortality phenomenon across the planet is there's a really strong signal for temperature anomalies. So it's not just that sites where trees are dying in mass, big pulses of tree mortality are where it's dry. It's often where it's dry and hotter than normal at the same time. And so we think that is causing a big problem for a lot of trees. That's probably the driver that I've studied the most, but it's just one of this complex of different drivers of tree mortality that are out there. And so at the global scale, it's a little hard to say which one of these might win out, but I would have to say people. Either directly with deforestation,
Right.
or maybe indirectly through our carbon emissions,
Sure.
intensifying the problems that trees face when it's hotter and drier at the same time.
And perhaps management decisions is folded into those.
It is. It also feeds into other things like, the biotic agents of tree mortality. Life cycles are accelerated, so generation times go down, and now populations can grow larger and maybe even overwhelm defenses of healthy trees. You think about the tropics and storm damage being a leading driver of mortality. Storm intensity. We know something about how warm waters create more storms here in Florida locally, but generally speaking, storm intensities are on the rise with the additional energy in the atmosphere.
So the name of the game is to try and keep our trees healthy and resistant to some of these stressors.
I think so. And, I am a real downer of a person to invite on the podcast because I'm like, let's talk about death and dying and gloom and doom and doomed. But that same paper where we first quantified what we call hotter drought fingerprint of Earth's forest mortality, in that paper, we also looked forward in climate to say, how much more common are these pulses of tree death likely to be if we allow the Earth to warm by 2C or if we allow the Earth to warm by 4C. And by 2C, it's not good. It goes up about 20-something%, but by plus 4C, it's like 140%. And so the reason that's hopeful to me is that actually it ain't over. There's lots of action that we can take, and likely every action that humanity can take to limit the further warming of the planet will be one of the most decisive benefits we can provide to trees, whether they be in our cities or in our forests. This is one of the things that likely is going to be most beneficial. The other thing is that we're starting to do a lot of work on trying to understand how do we future-proof our forests,
Sure.
right? So we're working with loblolly pine, the most widely planted tree in the Southeast and probably North America, and looking across the range-wide genetic diversity of this species, we found that some existing trees have a really incredible potential tolerance to drought and hotter drought, and even resilience to it, the ability to bounce back and to grow. And so it might mean that we're going to need to look for new solutions as the climate continues to intensify. How do we identify these kind of already existing winning genetic combinations? How do we get these kind of integrated into the programs at various universities and industry partners that are looking to improve trees and make them able not just to grow and produce the products that we need, but able to survive likely intensifying and maybe even more frequent extreme conditions. And so trees are tough. They're resilient. And they can't withstand anything because we have been able to quantify how dry is too dry and how hot is too hot. And so this is, to me, where I get really hopeful as an ecologist, is that in the variety and in the diversity of the ways trees are built, their functional traits, their tolerance traits, might lie a lot of the potential solutions to managing forests, especially to be able to continue to provide the many services that we as humans depend on, and just their own intrinsic value, because a forest in and of itself is a wonderful thing.
Well, Bill, I think that's a wonderful spot to end on. You had mentioned being all doom and gloom, yet we're ending on a hopeful note. So thank you again, Bill, for being on the show with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'd love to come back and talk about dead trees anytime.
On that note, thank you, everybody, and we will see you in the next one.
Thanks for tuning in. For more information, head on over to the Proforest website at proforesthealth.org. For any questions you may have, or to stay updated on all things Proforest, check out our social media at ProforestUF on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Episode hosted by Dr. Tyler Carney. This podcast was edited by Ben Ginkars Davies. The Proforest Podforest is brought to you by Proforest, Proactive Forest Health and Resilience at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.